I gripped the steering wheel tighter as another hairpin turn sent my beat-up Honda leaning hard to the right. The engine groaned like it was personally offended by the steep mountain grade, but at least it kept climbing. 3 hours of this winding road, and we weren't even close to the campsite yet. Behind me, Charlie had given up trying to get a decent signal and was just staring at his phone screen like it might magically connect to civilization. His thumb kept swiping, refresh after refresh, even though we'd lost all bars about 20 miles back. Jake pressed his forehead against the passenger window, watching the pine trees blur past. Still had his button-down shirt and khakis on from whatever meeting he'd rushed out of to make this trip. Danny looked like he was trying to disappear into the back seat, head tilted back, eyes closed. Every few minutes he'd let out this long sigh that said everything about how much he wanted to be anywhere else. This wasn't exactly the enthusiastic road trip I'd pictured when I spent 2 months talking them into this camping weekend. Back in college, we'd done stuff like this all the time. Spontaneous adventures, sleeping under the stars, just hanging out without any agenda. Now getting these guys to commit to a single weekend felt like negotiating a business deal. "How much further?" Danny's voice came from the back, flat and tired. "GPS says another 40 minutes to the trailhead." I checked the rearview mirror and caught his expression. "Come on, man. Once we get there and set up camp, you'll remember why we used to love this stuff." "Right." He didn't sound convinced. Charlie finally looked up from his phone. "There's literally zero signal out here. What if something happens?" "Nothing's gonna happen," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "It's just camping. We've all done this before." Jake shifted in his seat and rubbed his eyes. "I should have changed clothes before we left. These pants aren't exactly hiking material. We've got extra stuff if you need it." I'd packed enough gear for all of us, knowing at least one of them would show up unprepared. "Look, I know you guys are tired and stressed, but this is exactly why we need to do this. Get away from work, from phones, from all that stuff. Just be friends again." The silence that followed felt heavier than the mountain air. I'd been planning this trip since spring, sending group texts about dates, researching campsites, buying supplies. Each conversation had been like pulling teeth, with Danny constantly finding excuses and Charlie acting like I was asking him to climb Everest. Only Jake had seemed genuinely interested, and even he looked exhausted now. The road finally leveled out as we reached the plateau where the trailhead was marked. A small wooden sign pointed toward Cascade Ridge Campground 2 miles with an arrow directing us down a narrow dirt path. I turned off the main road and the Honda immediately started bouncing over rocks and ruts. "Jesus," Danny muttered as his head knocked against the window. "Almost there." I tried to keep my voice upbeat, but each pothole made me wince. The last thing we needed was to blow a tire out here. The dirt road wound through thick stands of pine and fir, their branches forming a canopy so dense that only scattered patches of late afternoon light made it through. After what felt like 20 minutes of careful driving, we finally emerged into a clearing where several marked campsites sat in a rough circle around a central fire pit area. I parked next to a weathered picnic table and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt almost oppressive after hours of road noise and engine strain. Through the windshield, I could see one other campsite already occupied. A single tent set up with military precision, camping gear arranged in neat rows. "This is it," I announced, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. We climbed out of the car, stretching and looking around. The clearing was bigger than I'd expected from the online photos, with plenty of space for our tents and a good view of the surrounding mountains. Pine-scented air hit me immediately, clean and sharp after the stuffiness of the car. Charlie walked over to the nearest tree and held his phone up high, searching for signal. Still nothing. Danny lit a cigarette and took a long drag, looking around like he was surveying a prison yard. "How long are we supposed to stay out here?" "Just 2 nights, I said, popping the trunk. "Tonight, tomorrow night, then we drive back Sunday morning." Jake stood beside the car, hands in his pockets, taking in the campsite. At least he wasn't complaining. "It's quiet," he said. "That's something." I started pulling our gear out of the trunk. Tents, sleeping bags, the cooler I'd packed with enough food for a week. The guys moved slowly, grabbing their stuff without much conversation. Danny kept smoking and checking his watch like he had somewhere important to be. Charlie had given up on his phone and was just standing there, hands hanging at his sides. We'd barely started setting up when footsteps approached from the occupied campsite. A man in his 50s walked over, weathered face and graying hair, wearing clothes that looked like they'd seen plenty of outdoor use. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in the woods. "Need any help with those stakes?" he asked Jake, who was struggling with the corner of his tent. "Ground's pretty hard here. Trick is to find the soft spots between the roots." Jake looked up, relieved. "Yeah, actually, I'm not exactly an expert at this." The man knelt down and showed Jake how to angle the stakes, working them into the ground with quick, efficient movements. "I'm Ben, by the way. Ben Harrison." He stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. "Been camping here about 3 weeks now." 3 weeks? I set down the cooler and walked over. "That's quite a stay." Ben shrugged. "Wife left me back in April. Needed some time to think things through." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. "Mountains are good for that kind of thing." Jake shook Ben's hand. "I'm Jake. This is Mike, Charlie, and Danny. And..." Ben nodded to each of us in turn. Danny gave a brief wave before going back to his cigarette. Charlie managed a polite hello, but kept glancing toward his useless phone. I found myself genuinely grateful for Ben's presence. At least someone here seemed happy to be in the woods. "You guys picked a good spot," Ben continued, helping Jake straighten his tent. "Gets morning sun but stays shaded in the afternoon. I've been watching this site for weeks, figured someone would claim it eventually." "You've been watching our site?" Danny's voice had an edge to it. Ben chuckled. "Not watching, just noticed it was empty. Prime real estate, camping-wise." He gestured toward the surrounding trees. "Plus, you're close enough to the trail system if you want to do some hiking." I started unpacking my own tent, listening to Ben chat with Jake about the best hiking routes and water sources. The man clearly knew the area well, and Jake seemed grateful for the advice. At least someone was engaging positively with this trip. Danny had moved to the far side of our campsite, smoking and staring off into the trees like he was calculating escape routes. Charlie was attempting to set up his tent but kept getting the poles tangled. I walked over to help him, and we worked together in silence, the only sounds coming from Ben and Jake's conversation about trail conditions. "This is exactly what I was hoping for," I said quietly to Charlie as we stretched the tent fabric. "Getting away from everything, just hanging out like we used to." Charlie glanced around the campsite, taking in Danny's obvious misery and Jake's tired posture. "Yeah, well, we're not exactly college kids anymore." The comment stung more than I'd expected. I'd known this trip would be different from our old adventures, but I'd hoped some of that old energy would come back once we got away from our daily routines. Instead, it felt like I was dragging 3 reluctant participants through the motions of friendship. Ben finished helping Jake and walked back toward his own site. "If you guys need anything, just holler. I've got extra firewood and a pretty good camp stove if yours gives you trouble." "Thanks," I called after him. "Really appreciate the help." As Ben disappeared back to his campsite, I looked around at my friends. Jake was standing back, admiring his properly set up tent with something approaching satisfaction. Charlie had finally gotten his tent assembled, though it looked slightly lopsided. Danny had finished his cigarette and was now sitting on a log, staring at his phone even though he knew it was useless. The sun was dropping behind the thick pine trees, casting long shadows across our campsite. I'd imagined this moment differently, all of us working together, laughing about old times, excited for the evening ahead. Instead, the silence felt heavy with unspoken reluctance. I pulled the camping chairs out of my trunk and started arranging them around the fire pit. Each action felt mechanical, like I was going through the motions of a trip that was already falling apart. Danny looked up from his phone long enough to watch me work, then went back to staring at the blank screen. "I'm going to get a fire started," I announced to no one in particular. Jake walked over and picked up one of the chairs. "Good idea. Getting cold already." At least someone was trying. I knelt down and started arranging kindling in the fire pit, trying to focus on the task instead of the growing certainty that this weekend was going to be a disaster. 3 months of planning, all that money on supplies and campsite fees, weeks of convincing everyone to clear their schedules. And for what? So we could sit around in uncomfortable silence while Danny counted the hours until we could leave? I struck a match and held it to the dry pine needles I'd gathered. The flame caught quickly, spreading to the smaller twigs. At least something was going according to plan. Behind me, I heard Charlie unzipping his tent and rummaging around inside. Danny was still on his log, occasionally glancing toward the woods like he expected something to emerge from the trees. Jake sat down in one of the chairs and watched me build up the fire, but even he seemed lost in his own thoughts. As the flames grew higher and the first real warmth spread across the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a serious mistake bringing everyone out here. We weren't the same people we'd been in college, and no amount of nostalgia was going to change that. The mountains were beautiful, the air was clean, and we had everything we needed for a perfect camping trip. But looking around at my friends' faces in the growing firelight, I was starting to think this weekend was already doomed. I poked at the can of beans balanced on the grill grate, watching them bubble and steam in the firelight. The smell of wood smoke and simple camp food should have felt nostalgic, like our old college trips. But the silence around the fire felt forced. 2 hours of setup and settling in, and we still couldn't find our rhythm. Danny sat across from me, moving food around on his paper plate without actually eating much. Every few minutes, he'd pull out his phone, thumb the screen awake, stare at the no service message, then shove it back in his pocket with visible frustration. Charlie had given up on his phone entirely and was working his way through a sandwich, but even he seemed distracted, glancing toward the woods between bites. Jake was the only one making an effort at normal conversation, asking Ben about the best fishing spots and water sources in the area. Ben sat forward in his camp chair, hands clasped around a tin mug of coffee, clearly grateful for the company after weeks of solitude. "Stream about half a mile east runs pretty cold even in summer," Ben was saying, gesturing toward the dark trees. "Good trout fishing if you know where to look. Most people stick to the obvious pools, but the fish hide in the deeper pockets where the current slows down." "Might be worth checking out tomorrow," Jake said, looking around at the rest of us. "If anyone's interested in trying to catch something." Danny looked up from pushing beans around his plate. "How long are we planning to stay out here anyway?" "Just through Sunday morning," I said quickly. 2 nights, like we discussed." "Right." Danny's tone suggested he was already counting the hours. Ben sipped his coffee and studied Danny with curious eyes. "Not much of an outdoorsman?" "Not really." Danny lit another cigarette and took a long drag. "This was Mike's idea. Thought it would be fun to relive the glory days or whatever." The comment stung, but I tried not to let it show. "We used to do stuff like this all the time in college. Camping, hiking, just getting away from everything." "Yeah, well," Danny flicked ash into the fire where it sparked and disappeared. "Things change." Ben nodded slowly, like he understood something the rest of us didn't. "Change isn't always permanent, though. Sometimes you find things out here that remind you who you really are." Charlie finally looked up from his sandwich. "What do you mean?" Ben leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful in the flickering light. "Been camping in these woods for 3 weeks now. You see things differently when you spend enough time away from civilization. Notice details that most people miss." "Like what?" Jake asked. Ben was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality to it, more focused and intense. Lights moving through the trees at night. Not flashlights or campfires. Something else entirely. Danny stopped eating and looked up sharply. What kind of lights? Hard to describe. Ben set down his coffee mug and leaned forward again. Blue-white, about the size of a basketball. They move between the trees like they're following some kind of pattern, but not random. Purposeful. I felt my stomach tighten. The last thing we needed was ghost stories or whatever Ben was working up to. Probably just other campers. Ben shook his head. No. I've seen plenty of flashlights and lanterns over the years. This is different. These lights, they pulse, almost like they're breathing. Charlie set down his sandwich completely, now fully focused on Ben's story. How many times have you seen them? 5, maybe 6 nights over the past 2 weeks. Always between midnight and 3 in the morning. Always moving north through the trees toward that rocky ridge. Ben pointed off into the darkness beyond our campsite. Jake looked where Ben was pointing, though there was nothing visible except black forest. Any idea what causes them? I followed one about a week ago, Ben continued, his eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made me uncomfortable. Tracked it for maybe 2 miles through some pretty rough terrain. Lost it near a rocky outcropping up on the northern ridge. Danny dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. And you think that's normal? Following weird lights through the woods in the middle of the night? Ben chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. Nothing about this place is normal if you pay attention. But dangerous? No. The lights aren't dangerous, just mysterious. What color did you say they were? Charlie asked, completely absorbed now. Blue-white, but not steady. They pulse and shift, sometimes getting brighter, sometimes dimmer. And they move smooth, like they're floating just above the ground. Ben picked up his coffee mug again and took a slow sip. You might see them too if you keep your eyes open tonight. The thought of strange lights moving through the darkness around our campsite made my skin crawl. I'd brought everyone out here to reconnect and relax, not to chase after mysterious phenomena with a stranger who'd been living alone in the woods for weeks. Maybe we should focus on more normal camping stuff, I said, trying to steer the conversation away from Ben's lights. Hiking? Fishing? Just hanging out without all the weirdness. Danny nodded emphatically. Exactly. I vote we pack up first thing tomorrow and head home. This whole trip was a mistake. A mistake? Charlie's voice had an edge to it suddenly. We haven't even been here one day. Long enough to know I don't want to be here, Danny shot back. I've got problems at work, problems with my girlfriend, and sitting around a fire listening to ghost stories isn't exactly helping my stress level. Maybe if you tried actually participating instead of complaining about everything, Charlie said, his own irritation finally showing. Participating in what? There's nothing to do out here except sit around and pretend this is still fun. It could be fun if you'd give it a chance instead of being miserable about everything. Danny stood up abruptly, his paper plate falling to the ground. Fun? You want to know what would be fun? Having a job that doesn't make me want to kill myself. Having a girlfriend who doesn't threaten to leave me every other week. Maybe fixing some actual problems instead of hiding in the woods pretending everything's fine. Nobody's pretending anything, Charlie said, standing up to face him. But running away from your problems isn't going to solve them either. Oh, that's rich coming from you. When's the last time you committed to anything longer than a weekend? Jake held up his hands. Guys, come on. Let's not do this. But Danny was just getting started. This whole trip is just Mike trying to recreate something that doesn't exist anymore. We're not college kids. We're not best friends hanging out like nothing's changed. We're just 4 people who used to know each other pretending we still have something in common. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. I'd known the group dynamic was different now, but hearing Danny lay it out so bluntly made the failure of this trip feel complete and final. Ben watched the argument unfold with what looked like genuine interest, his eyes moving between Danny and Charlie like he was studying their conflict. When the shouting died down to angry silence, he spoke up again. "You know," Ben said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the still air, "I've met a lot of people in these woods over the years. Hikers, campers, folks just passing through. Some of them got curious about the lights, too." Charlie sat back down, still glaring at Danny. What happened to them? Ben took another sip of coffee and stared into the fire for a long moment. "Well, that's the interesting thing. Some people follow the lights and come back with stories. Others," he shrugged, "others follow the lights and never come back to tell about what they found." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The casual way Ben said it, like he was commenting on the weather, made it somehow worse than if he'd tried to sound scary. Danny was still standing, looking down at all of us around the fire. "Great. Perfect. Mysterious lights and missing people. This just keeps getting better." But I barely heard him. Ben's comment echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation was very wrong. The way Ben had appeared so conveniently when we arrived, his intense focus on the lights, his obvious pleasure at our group conflict, and now this offhand mention of people disappearing. I looked around the fire at my friends' faces in the flickering light. Danny angry and agitated, Charlie fascinated despite himself, Jake tired but trying to keep the peace. None of them seemed to grasp what Ben had just said, or maybe they were too caught up in their own problems to care. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling up into the dark sky, and for a moment the only sound was the soft crackling of burning wood. Beyond the edge of our campsite, the forest pressed in on all sides, black and silent and suddenly feeling much less safe than it had an hour ago. The cold mountain air bit through my sleeping bag as I shifted awake, my body stiff from sleeping on uneven ground. Something had pulled me out of sleep, a sound or movement that didn't belong. I unzipped my tent flap quietly and peered outside. Danny sat cross-legged on a log about 10 feet away, fully dressed, staring into the dark trees beyond our campsite. His shoulders were hunched forward, and even in the dim, pre-dawn light I could see the tension in his posture. A half-empty pack of cigarettes lay beside him on the log. I crawled out of my tent and walked over, my joints protesting after a night on the hard ground. Danny didn't look up when I approached, just kept staring into the forest like he expected something to emerge from the shadows. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, settling down on the log beside him. "Not a minute." His voice was hoarse, like he'd been awake for hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about work. My boss has been on my case all month about the Henderson account, and if I don't fix things when I get back... He trailed off and lit another cigarette with shaking hands. "What about your girlfriend?" Danny took a long drag and exhaled slowly. "Sarah gave me an ultimatum before I left. Said if I don't figure out what I want and stop being so miserable all the time, she's done. Moving out. Finding someone who actually wants to be alive." He laughed bitterly. Can't really blame her. The admission hung between us in the quiet morning air. I'd known Danny was struggling, but hearing him lay out the extent of his problems made me realize how much I'd underestimated what he was dealing with. A tent zipper opened behind us, and Jake emerged looking like he'd been hit by a truck. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He moved slowly, like every joint hurt. "Morning," he mumbled, running his hands through his hair. "Anyone else feel like they got run over?" Charlie's tent rustled, followed by muffled cursing as he apparently tried to untangle himself from his sleeping bag. More zipping sounds. Then he crawled out looking equally exhausted. His shirt was twisted sideways, and he had red marks on his face from where his pillow had pressed against his cheek. "Jesus, what time is it?" Charlie squinted around the campsite, trying to get his bearings. "About 6, I said, checking my watch. "Sun should be up soon." The sound of confident footsteps approached from Ben's campsite. He walked over looking completely refreshed, like he'd slept 10 hours in a luxury hotel instead of camping in the wilderness. His clothes were neat, his hair combed, and his eyes were bright and alert. The contrast with the rest of us was jarring. "Good morning, gentlemen," Ben said cheerfully. "Beautiful day to be in the mountains." Jake rubbed his eyes and nodded weakly. Charlie just stared at Ben like he couldn't comprehend how anyone could be that energetic this early. "I'll get some coffee going," I said, grateful for something normal to focus on. I pulled out my camp stove and set up the instant coffee supplies I'd packed. The familiar routine of lighting the burner and heating water felt grounding after the weird tension of last night. Ben sat down on one of the camp chairs we'd left around the dead fire pit. "You know, I saw them again last night. The lights. Brighter than ever, actually." Danny's head snapped up from his cigarette. "What?" "The lights I told you about. They appeared around 2 in the morning, same general area as before, but this time there were more of them, maybe 3 or 4 moving in formation through the trees." Ben's voice carried the same intense focus it had developed the night before. "I've been tracking their patterns for the past week, and they're definitely following some kind of route." Charlie perked up despite his exhaustion. "Every night. Every single night for 7 days straight now." Ben leaned forward in his chair. "At first I thought it might be random, but the timing is too consistent. Always between midnight and 3 a.m., always moving from the southern tree line toward that rocky ridge." The water started boiling, and I busied myself mixing instant coffee into camp mugs. The normal task helped me focus on something other than Ben's increasingly obsessive fixation on his mysterious lights. "Here," I said, handing out the coffee. "Everyone needs caffeine." Ben accepted his mug but barely glanced at it, his attention still fixed on the tree line. "The interesting thing is how they respond to observation. When I just watch from a distance, they move in predictable patterns. But when I try to get closer..." "Maybe we should focus on regular camping stuff today," I interrupted, pulling granola bars out of my pack and distributing them. "There's supposed to be good fishing in that stream you mentioned. Or we could do some hiking, check out the area." Ben finally looked away from the trees, and something in his expression made me uncomfortable. It was like I'd interrupted something important to him, and he wasn't pleased about it. "Of course," he said, but his tone suggested the fishing and hiking were trivial distractions. "Though if you're planning to explore the area, you should know about the lights. They're part of this place now." Charlie unwrapped his granola bar and took a bite. "I think we should investigate. I mean, if something unusual is happening out here, why wouldn't we want to know what it is?" "Because it's probably nothing," Danny said sharply. "Just Ben seeing things after being alone in the woods for too long." Ben's expression hardened slightly. "I know what I've seen." "Right." Danny stood up abruptly, tossing his cigarette butt into the cold fire pit. "And I know what I've seen too. A guy who's been camping by himself for 3 weeks talking about mysterious lights. That's not exactly a reliable witness." Jake sipped his coffee and tried to mediate. "Look, whether the lights are real or not, we're here to relax and hang out. Maybe we can do both. Check out the area during the day, see if anything seems unusual." "Exactly," Charlie said, warming to the idea. "We could hike up toward that ridge Ben mentioned. If there's really something going on, we might find some evidence." I felt the group dynamic shifting in a direction I didn't like. The whole point of this trip was supposed to be reconnecting as friends, not chasing after whatever had captured Ben's imagination during his weeks of isolation. "We should probably stick together, though," I said carefully. "I mean, if we're going to explore, let's do it as a group. No one wandering off alone." Ben laughed, and the sound had an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "The forest isn't dangerous for people who understand it. I've been hiking these woods alone for weeks without any problems." The way he said it bothered me more than I could articulate. There was a dismissiveness in his tone, like he considered the rest of us incapable of handling whatever he'd been dealing with out here. I caught him glancing toward the tree line again, his eyes scanning the forest with the focused intensity of someone waiting for something specific to happen. Danny finished his coffee and set the mug down harder than necessary. This is exactly what I was talking about last night. We're supposed to be having a normal camping trip, not following some stranger around looking for imaginary lights. They're not imaginary, Ben said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Right. Sure they're not. Danny lit another cigarette, his hands still shaking slightly. Just like everything else in my life that's falling apart, this trip is turning into exactly what I didn't want it to be. Charlie set down his granola bar and turned to face Danny. Maybe if you stopped being so negative about everything, you might actually enjoy something for once. Enjoy what? Sitting around listening to ghost stories? Arguing about whether we should go chasing lights through the woods? Danny took a long drag and exhaled aggressively. This whole thing is a waste of time. Ben watched the exchange with obvious interest, like he was studying our group dynamics for some purpose I couldn't understand. When Danny and Charlie's argument died down to sullen silence, Ben spoke up again. You know, he said, his voice taking on that same conversational tone he'd used the night before when talking about people who never came back. Most folks who come out here miss the really interesting stuff because they're too focused on what they think camping should be like. Jake finished his coffee and stood up, stretching. What do you mean? I mean, you can fish and hike anywhere, but how often do you get the chance to witness something genuinely unexplained? Ben's eyes moved between Charlie and Jake, pointedly excluding Danny and me from his appeal. Most people spend their whole lives in routine, never experiencing anything that challenges what they think they know about the world. Charlie nodded slowly. That's actually a good point. I realized with growing unease that Ben was actively working to divide our group, encouraging Charlie's curiosity while dismissing the concerns Danny and I had raised. The casual confidence with which he discussed the lights, the way he'd positioned himself as an expert on the area, the intense focus he maintained on the forest even during normal conversation, none of it felt right. By the time we'd finished our simple breakfast and started discussing plans for the day, the division in our group had become obvious. Charlie wanted to explore and investigate Ben's claims. Jake remained diplomatically neutral, but seemed willing to go along with whatever we decided. Danny wanted to pack up and leave immediately, and I found myself caught between wanting to keep everyone safe and not wanting to appear as paranoid as Danny. Ben continued scanning the tree line throughout our conversation, occasionally pointing out areas where he claimed to have seen the most activity. His behavior had shifted from the friendly, helpful neighbor of yesterday to something more intense and focused, like someone with a specific agenda he was working toward. The morning sun had finally cleared the mountains, casting long shadows across our campsite, but instead of feeling like the start of a normal day of camping, it felt like we were all waiting for something to happen. Something Ben was confident would occur, whether we wanted it to or not. After we cleaned up from breakfast and packed away the camp stove, I made a decision that felt necessary, despite the group's obvious tension. We needed to get away from camp, away from Ben's constant scanning of the tree line and his increasingly intense focus on those supposed lights. There's a lake about 2 miles north of here, I announced, shouldering my day pack. Good spot for lunch, maybe some decent views. Anyone interested in a hike? Jake nodded immediately, grateful for something concrete to do. Charlie looked up from where he'd been staring into the woods, still caught up in Ben's stories from the morning. Danny groaned audibly and lit another cigarette. 2 miles? Through the woods? Danny shook his head. I didn't pack hiking boots for this trip. It's not that bad, I said, trying to keep my voice encouraging. Trails well marked, mostly flat terrain. Ben had been sitting quietly in his camp chair, but suddenly he stood up with renewed energy. Excellent idea. I know that lake well. Been there several times in the past few weeks. Beautiful spot, and it's actually very close to the northern ridge where most of the activity happens. The way he said activity made my stomach tighten, but I forced a smile. Great. Should be a nice change of pace. 20 minutes later, we set off on a dirt trail that wound through dense stands of pine and fir. I led the way with Jake close behind, while Charlie walked alongside Ben about 10 feet back. Danny brought up the rear, already complaining about rocks in his shoes. Ben carried a compass in his hand, checking it every few minutes even though the trail was clearly marked. He kept looking over his shoulder, not back toward our campsite but into the woods around us, like he expected to see something moving between the trees. "Your wife," Charlie said as they walked together. "What was her problem with camping?" Ben's expression darkened. Sarah never understood the value of real experiences. She preferred shopping malls and restaurant patios to actual wilderness. Called it roughing it if the hotel didn't have room service. "Some people just aren't outdoorsy," Jake offered diplomatically from ahead of us. "It wasn't about being outdoorsy," Ben said, his voice taking on an edge. "It was about being weak. She was afraid of anything that challenged her comfortable little bubble. Solitude, discovery, real connection with the natural world. None of that mattered to her." I glanced back and saw Charlie hanging on every word, completely absorbed in Ben's bitter assessment of his failed marriage. The resentment in Ben's voice was obvious, and it made me wonder what other grievances he'd been nursing during his weeks alone in these woods. "So you came out here to think things through?" Charlie asked. "I came out here to find what she was too scared to look for," Ben said, checking his compass again. "Some people are content to live their entire lives without ever witnessing anything extraordinary. They prefer the safety of predictable routines to the possibility of genuine discovery." Behind us, Danny stumbled over a root and muttered a string of curses. "How much further to this lake? My feet are killing me." "About a mile," I called back, though I could hear the blisters forming in his voice. Danny's sneakers weren't designed for trail hiking, and his chain smoking hadn't prepared him for sustained physical activity. "This is exactly why I hate camping," Danny said, stopping to lean against a tree. "Everything hurts, nothing works the way it's supposed to, and there's no point to any of it." "The point," Ben said, turning around to face Danny with obvious irritation, "is to experience something beyond your normal existence. But that requires being open to possibilities instead of complaining about every minor discomfort." Danny straightened up, his face flushed from exertion and annoyance. "Right. Sorry for not appreciating the spiritual benefits of foot pain." Ben stared at him for a moment, then turned and continued walking without another word. The tension between them was getting worse, and I found myself caught between wanting to defend Danny and not wanting to provoke Ben further. The trail climbed gradually through sections of heavy forest, opening occasionally into small clearings where filtered sunlight reached the ground. Ben continued checking his compass obsessively, and I noticed he kept looking toward what I assumed was the northern ridge he'd mentioned, though the dense trees blocked any view of distant terrain. When we finally reached the lake an hour later, the view was genuinely beautiful. Clear blue water stretched about 200 yards across, surrounded by rocky shores and backed by forested hills. A few ducks moved quietly near the far shore, and the whole scene had the kind of pristine quality that made the hike feel worthwhile. Ben immediately walked to the northern edge of the lake and pointed toward a rocky ridge visible through the trees on the opposite shore. "There," he said, his voice carrying that same intense focus from the morning. "That's where I've seen the brightest activity. The lights appear just below the tree line, then move down toward the water." Jake sat down on a large rock and pulled out a water bottle. "Any chance it could be aircraft? Maybe military exercises or something?" Ben shook his head dismissively. "Aircraft don't pulse like living things. These lights have rhythm, purpose. They respond to observation, almost like they're aware of being watched." "What do you mean, respond?" Charlie asked, sitting down beside Ben on the rocky shore. "When I watch from a distance, they move in predictable patterns. But when I try to get closer, they change direction, move faster, sometimes disappear entirely." Ben's eyes remained fixed on the ridge across the water. "It's like they're testing me, seeing how committed I am to understanding what they really are." The way he described it made my skin crawl. Ben wasn't just observing some natural phenomenon. He was having an ongoing interaction with whatever he thought he was seeing. The obsessive quality of his focus, combined with his obvious bitterness about his wife and his weeks of isolation, painted a picture of someone who'd lost perspective on reality. Danny finally caught up to us, breathing heavily and limping slightly. He collapsed on the nearest rock and immediately pulled out his cigarettes. "Okay, we've seen the lake. Can we go back now?" "We just got here," Charlie said, clearly not ready to leave. "This is exactly the kind of place where you might see something unusual. Remote, quiet, close to where Ben's been having sightings." "Right," Danny said, lighting his cigarette with shaking hands. "Because that's exactly what I want, to see whatever's been driving him crazy for the past month." Ben's head snapped toward Danny, and for a moment his expression was genuinely hostile. "I'm not crazy. I'm the only person out here paying attention to what's actually happening." Jake finished drinking and stood up, obviously trying to diffuse the tension. "Look, maybe there's a logical explanation. Bears reflecting light, atmospheric phenomena, even geological activity that creates optical illusions." "I've considered all of that," Ben said, his irritation growing. "I'm not some tourist who gets excited by fireflies. I've been camping and hiking for 30 years, and I know the difference between normal wilderness experiences and something genuinely unexplained." "But how do you know they're not just—" Jake started. "Because I've seen them up close," Ben interrupted, his voice sharp. "I've followed them, tracked them, observed their behavior patterns. They're not random, they're not natural, and they're not imaginary." The conversation was heading in a direction that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Ben's defensiveness about his sightings, combined with his obvious resentment toward anyone who questioned them, suggested someone who'd become completely invested in beliefs that might have no basis in reality. We spent another hour at the lake, eating trail mix and drinking water while Ben continued describing his theories about the lights. Charlie asked detailed questions about timing and movement patterns, completely fascinated by every detail. Jake remained politely skeptical, offering practical explanations that Ben dismissed with growing annoyance. Danny sat apart from the group, smoking and periodically checking his useless phone. By the time we started back toward camp in the late afternoon, I'd made up my mind. Whatever Ben was chasing in these woods, I didn't want my friends involved. The obsessive intensity with which he discussed the lights, the bitter resentment he carried about his wife, and his obvious irritation with anyone who questioned his theories all pointed toward someone who'd spent too much time alone and lost touch with normal social boundaries. The hike back took longer than expected because Danny's blisters had gotten worse, forcing us to stop frequently while he adjusted his shoes and complained about the distance. Ben grew increasingly impatient with these delays, checking his compass repeatedly and looking toward the darkening forest, like we were missing something important by moving so slowly. When we finally reached our campsite, the sun was already sinking behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ben immediately went to his tent and began pulling out equipment: a folding chair, binoculars, a powerful flashlight, and what looked like a notebook filled with handwritten observations. He set up the chair facing the northern tree line, arranged his gear within easy reach, and sat down with the focused preparation of someone beginning an important job. The deliberate way he positioned everything made it clear this was a nightly ritual he'd been performing for weeks. I watched him arrange his light watching station and felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. This wasn't casual interest or scientific curiosity. This was obsession, and Ben had been feeding it alone in these woods long enough to lose perspective on what was real and what was wishful thinking. "We should probably turn in early tonight," I said, directing my comment toward Jake and Charlie. Maybe get an early start tomorrow, head home after breakfast. Ben's head turned toward me, and the expression on his face made me take a step back. The friendly, helpful neighbor from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone with hard eyes and a tight mouth. "That would be unfortunate," Ben said quietly. "You might miss something extraordinary if you leave too soon. Something that could change your perspective on everything you think you know about the world." The way he said it carried an unmistakable threat, though I couldn't quite articulate what he was threatening us with. But standing there in the gathering darkness, watching Ben arrange his equipment with obsessive precision while my friends debated whether to stay another night, I realized with growing certainty that Ben wasn't planning to let us leave without experiencing whatever he'd been chasing for weeks. Whether it was real or not, Ben believed in those lights completely, and he needed witnesses to validate what he'd been seeing. We weren't just fellow campers anymore. We were an audience he'd been waiting for, and he had no intention of letting us walk away from his show. The hike back from the lake had been tense, with Ben's increasingly agitated commentary about optimal viewing conditions and Danny's steady stream of complaints about his feet. I busied myself with dinner preparations, hoping normal camping activities might reset the group's mood. Ben, however, immediately went to the observation station he'd set up that morning. He arranged his chair facing the northern tree line, positioned his binoculars and flashlight within arm's reach, and opened his notebook to a page covered with times and crude diagrams. The deliberate precision of his setup made my stomach tighten. This wasn't casual stargazing or wildlife observation. It was the methodical preparation of someone who'd been performing the same ritual every night for weeks. Jake helped me distribute sandwiches and water bottles while Charlie sat close to Ben, asking detailed questions about light patterns and timing. Danny collapsed onto his usual log, immediately lighting a cigarette and staring at his phone screen even though he knew it was useless out here. "So, you see them every single night?" Charlie asked, unwrapping his sandwich but not taking a bite. "Every night for the past week," Ben confirmed, checking his watch. "Usually starts around midnight, peak activity between 1 and 3 a.m. The timing is remarkably consistent." I finished my sandwich and decided to address what needed to be said. "Look, I've been thinking about tomorrow. Maybe we should pack up early, head back after breakfast, get back to town before the afternoon traffic." Ben's head turned toward me, and the look he gave me was sharp with disapproval. "That would be extremely unfortunate. Tonight could be significant. I've noticed increased activity building over the past several nights." "How can you tell?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested polite skepticism rather than genuine interest. "Brightness, intensity, duration of appearances, movement patterns." Ben opened his notebook and showed us pages of handwritten observations. Times, compass directions, rough sketches of what appeared to be flight paths through the trees. "The data indicates we're approaching some kind of peak event." Charlie leaned over to examine the notebook, completely absorbed. "This is incredible. You've been tracking all of this?" "Scientific observation requires systematic documentation," Ben said, his voice carrying that same professorial tone he'd used earlier. "Most people see unusual phenomena and dismiss it because they don't take the time to gather real evidence." Danny looked up from his cigarette, his expression sour. "Right, because writing down times when you think you see lights makes them real." Ben closed the notebook with more force than necessary. "Skepticism without investigation is just willful ignorance." The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and I added another log, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. The familiar camping task felt grounding, but I couldn't shake the growing certainty that this trip had gotten away from me completely. "I think we should consider leaving," I said, directing my comment toward Jake and Charlie. "We came out here to relax and hang out, not to chase after whatever Ben thinks he's been seeing. Maybe it's time to call it a successful trip and head home." "We've barely been here 24 hours, Charlie protested. and this could be our only chance to witness something genuinely unexplained. How often does an opportunity like this come along? Jake stretched his legs and rubbed his eyes. I don't know. I'm pretty beat, and I've got meetings Monday morning I need to prepare for. Everything's always about meetings and schedules, Charlie said, his frustration obvious. When's the last time any of us did something that wasn't planned and practical? Danny flicked his cigarette into the fire and immediately lit another one. When's the last time any of us had jobs that didn't make us miserable and girlfriends who didn't threaten to leave us? Maybe practical is what we need right now. Ben listened to this exchange with obvious interest, studying our group dynamics like he was taking mental notes. When the argument died down to uncomfortable silence, he checked his watch again and shifted in his chair. It's almost 10, he announced. Peak visibility should begin within the next few hours. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving only our small circle of firelight surrounded by impenetrable forest darkness. Ben sat motionless in his chair, binoculars raised, scanning the tree line with methodical precision. Charlie moved his own chair closer to Ben's position, clearly planning to keep watch alongside him. I tried one more time. Listen, whatever you guys decide about tonight, can we at least agree to pack up first thing tomorrow? I've got to get back, and Danny's obviously not enjoying himself. Speak for yourself, Danny muttered, though his tone suggested he was grateful for the support. I stopped enjoying myself before we even got here. Ben suddenly straightened in his chair, lowering his binoculars and pointing toward a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards from our campsite. There. Do you see it? I followed his pointing finger, but saw only darkness between the tree trunks. Charlie immediately raised his own flashlight, sweeping the beam across the area Ben had indicated. I don't see anything, Jake said, squinting into the woods. About 15 feet up, moving laterally between the larger pines. Ben's voice carried absolute certainty. Blue-white, pulsing slowly. It's following the same pattern I observed 3 nights ago. Charlie stood up, flashlight in hand, taking several steps toward the tree line. I think I might see something. A faint glow, maybe? I grabbed Charlie's arm before he could go any further. Stay put. Whatever Ben thinks he's seeing, we don't need to go stumbling around in the dark trying to find it. Ben rose from his chair, his attention completely focused on the distant trees. I'm just going to get a closer look. Document the behavior from a different angle. Ben, that's not a good idea, I said. But he was already moving toward the woods, flashlight in hand. I'll stay within shouting distance, he called back without turning around. Just want to verify the movement pattern from 30 yards instead of 50. I watched Ben's flashlight beam disappear between the trees, leaving us in the uncertain glow of our dying fire. The forest swallowed him completely within seconds, and soon even the sound of his footsteps faded into silence. This is exactly what I was worried about, I said to the remaining group. Guy's been alone out here too long, and now he's chasing lights through the woods at night. Charlie remained standing, staring into the darkness where Ben had vanished. Maybe he's right, though. Maybe there really is something out there. Or maybe he's seeing things that aren't there, Danny said, lighting yet another cigarette with shaking hands. Either way, I don't like sitting here waiting for him to come back. For 20 minutes, we sat around the fire listening to occasional sounds from the woods, branches snapping under footsteps, rustling leaves, and once what sounded like Ben calling out to someone, though his words were too distant and muffled to understand. Jake checked his watch repeatedly, growing more uncomfortable as the minutes passed. Maybe we should call out to him, make sure he's okay. Ben! I shouted toward the trees. Everything all right out there? No response. The forest had gone completely silent, as if even the normal nighttime sounds of insects and small animals had stopped. Danny suddenly stood up, tossing his cigarette into the fire with violent force. That's it. I can't handle this anymore, sitting here waiting for some guy I barely know to come back from chasing imaginary lights. What are you going to do? Jake asked. I'm going to find him and drag him back here so we can pack up and get out of these woods. Danny grabbed one of the spare flashlights from our gear pile. I'm done with this whole thing. I stood up quickly, trying to intercept him. Danny, that's not smart. We don't know these woods, and it's pitch black out there. I know exactly where he went, Danny said, clicking on his flashlight and testing the beam. Same direction he's been staring at all day. I'll follow his trail, find him, and tell him the camping trip is over. Before I could stop him, Danny was walking toward the tree line, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he moved. Ben, where are you? Time to come back. Charlie immediately jumped up, grabbing his own flashlight. I'm going with him. They shouldn't be out there alone. Charlie, wait, I started, but he was already following Danny's path into the woods. We'll be right back, Charlie called over his shoulder. Just going to find Ben and bring everyone back to camp. I watched their flashlight beams grow smaller and more distant as they moved deeper into the forest, calling out for Ben every few minutes. Soon even their voices began to fade, swallowed by the dense trees and darkness. Jake and I sat by the dying fire, straining to hear any sound from the woods. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional pop and hiss of burning logs. Every few minutes we caught faint echoes of our friends calling Ben's name, but the sounds seemed to be coming from farther and farther away. This was a mistake, I said quietly, poking at the coals with a stick. The whole trip, bringing everyone out here, letting Ben get involved with whatever he's been chasing. Jake nodded, checking his watch again. How long do we wait before we go after them? I stared into the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight, listening to the fading voices of my friends as they moved deeper into the unknown forest, and realized I had no good answer to that question. Jake checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. It's been 15 minutes since they went after him. The fire had burned down to mostly coals, casting weak orange light that barely reached the edge of our clearing. Beyond that small circle, the forest pressed in like a solid wall of darkness. I added another log and watched flames lick up around the bark, but the added light only made the surrounding woods seem more impenetrable. Maybe we should give them a few more minutes, I said, though my voice carried no conviction. They probably just needed time to find Ben and convince him to come back. Jake stood up and walked to the edge of our campsite, peering into the darkness where our friends had disappeared. I can't hear them anymore. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. He was right. The forest had gone completely silent around us, as if every living thing had decided to hold its breath. No insects buzzing, no small animals rustling through undergrowth, no wind moving through the branches overhead. Just an oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and the emergency first aid kit from our gear pile. Come on, we need to go find them. Jake picked up his own flashlight and checked the beam. What if we get lost too? Then we follow our own trail back. I shouldered a small pack with water bottles and the GPS unit. But I'm not sitting here any longer waiting for something bad to happen. We left the fire burning and headed into the woods, following the same general direction our friends had taken. My flashlight beam swept back and forth across the forest floor, picking out broken branches and disturbed patches of undergrowth that suggested people had passed this way recently. Danny! Charlie! I called out every few minutes, pausing to listen for any response. Nothing came back except the echo of my own voice bouncing off distant trees. The trail wasn't hard to follow once we found it. Broken twigs hung at shoulder height where someone had pushed through thick vegetation, and scuffed areas in the dirt showed where multiple sets of feet had passed, but the complete absence of sound from ahead made my chest tight with worry. Jake moved beside me, his flashlight beam parallel to mine as we picked our way over fallen logs and around dense clusters of pine trees. This doesn't feel right, he said quietly. They should be making noise, calling back to us. Something. About half a mile from camp, my flashlight caught movement ahead. A figure standing motionless beside a large pine tree, beam pointed down at the ground. "Charlie!" I called out, relief flooding through me. Charlie's head turned toward us, but he didn't respond or move from his position. As we got closer, I could see his face in the flashlight glow, pale and strangely blank, like he was staring at something that had shocked him into silence. "Charlie, what's wrong? Where are Danny and Ben?" Charlie wordlessly shifted his flashlight beam, directing the light toward the base of a rocky slope about 10 feet away. My own beam followed his, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Ben lay twisted at the bottom of the incline, his body positioned in a way that looked fundamentally wrong. One leg was folded beneath him at an angle that made me wince, and his head was turned too far to the side, showing the white of his neck where it bent against the rocks. I moved closer, playing my flashlight over Ben's still form. His eyes stared up at the canopy above, unblinking and reflecting my light like glass. The expression on his face was one of complete surprise, mouth slightly open as if he'd been caught off guard by whatever had happened to him. "Jesus," Jake whispered behind me. "Is he—" I knelt beside Ben and pressed my fingers against his throat, though I already knew what I'd find. No pulse, no warmth, no sign of life. His skin felt cold and waxy under my touch, and when I tried to close his eyelids, the muscles had already begun to stiffen. "He's dead," I said, sitting back on my heels. "Looks like he fell down the rocks, broke his neck." Charlie finally spoke, his voice flat and mechanical. "I found him like this, just lying here." "What about Danny?" Jake asked, sweeping his flashlight beam around the immediate area. "Where's Danny?" "I don't know." Charlie's hands were shaking as he held his flashlight. "I've been calling for him, but there's no answer. He was right behind me when we were following Ben's trail, and then suddenly he wasn't there anymore." I stood up and backed away from Ben's body, trying to process what had happened. The rocky slope wasn't particularly steep or dangerous looking, but in the dark it would be easy enough to lose footing and fall. Ben had been so focused on those lights he claimed to see, maybe he'd been careless about where he was walking. "We need to find Danny," I said, forcing myself to think practically, despite the sight of Ben's broken body. "Then we head back to camp and figure out how to get help." Jake nodded, already moving his flashlight beam in wide arcs around the area. "Danny, can you hear us?" We spread out in a rough triangle, staying within sight of each other while searching the woods around Ben's location. The beam of my flashlight picked out pine trunks, scattered rocks, and patches of undergrowth, but no sign of our missing friend. "Danny!" I called again, louder this time. "Where are you?" Charlie moved methodically through a cluster of smaller trees, checking behind each trunk as if Danny might be hiding. Jake worked his way up the rocky slope where Ben had fallen, testing each step carefully to avoid the same fate. We'd been searching for nearly 20 minutes when I heard it, a low, barely audible moaning sound coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. The sound was so quiet I almost missed it, but it definitely sounded human. "Did you guys hear that?" I stopped moving and held up my hand for silence. The moaning came again, weak and muffled, from a direction that led further away from our campsite. We followed the sound, moving carefully through dense vegetation that scraped against our clothing and caught at our flashlight beams. I found him pressed against the trunk of a thick oak tree, slumped forward like he'd collapsed there and couldn't move. Danny's shirt was torn across the shoulder, and dark scratches ran down both his arms where something had raked across his skin. His face was scratched too, 3 parallel lines across his left cheek that looked like claw marks. "Danny!" I dropped to my knees beside him, checking for serious injuries. "What happened? Are you hurt?" His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond my shoulder. When I touched his arm, he jerked slightly but didn't seem to recognize me at first. Danny, it's Mike. Can you hear me? Mike? His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse like he'd been screaming. Is that really you? Yeah, it's me. Jake and Charlie are here too. We came looking for you guys. I helped him sit up straighter against the tree trunk, checking his pupils with the flashlight beam. They looked normal, though he was clearly in shock. Ben, Danny said, gripping my arm with surprising strength. Something happened to Ben. We found him, I said gently. He fell down some rocks. He's dead, Danny. Danny's grip tightened on my arm and his eyes suddenly focused on my face with urgent intensity. No, he whispered. It wasn't a fall. Something was hunting us out here. Something that killed Ben. The way he said it, with absolute certainty despite his obvious confusion and injury, made the hair on my arm stand up. I glanced at Jake and Charlie, who had moved closer to listen. What do you mean, hunting you? Jake asked quietly. Danny looked past me into the dark woods, his face filled with terror I'd never seen before. It was watching us, following us, and it's still out there. Danny could barely support his own weight. I had his left arm draped over my shoulders, practically carrying him as we picked our way through the dense undergrowth back toward camp. Every few steps he'd stumble and catch himself against a tree trunk, breathing hard and wincing from whatever had happened to him out there. Keep moving, I whispered, adjusting my grip on his waist. We're going to get you back to camp and figure this out. Danny's head kept turning back toward the darkness behind us, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from seeing something that shouldn't exist. The scratches across his face looked worse in the moving flashlight beams. 3 distinct parallel lines that started at his temple and ran down to his jaw. Charlie moved in a wide circle around us, sweeping his flashlight beam through the trees in methodical arcs. The light picked out pine trunks and hanging branches, but nothing else. Just empty forest that somehow felt less empty than it should. Jake walked ahead of us, checking his phone's GPS every few minutes and calling out course corrections. Bearing northeast, about 600 yards to go, he said quietly. But we need to move faster. My battery's almost dead. I tried to pick up the pace, but Danny's legs kept giving out. His breathing was ragged, and sweat covered his face despite the cold mountain air. Whatever had happened to him in those woods had left him shaken in a way that went beyond physical injury. Danny, you've got to help me here, I said, readjusting his weight across my shoulders. Can you put more pressure on your right leg? He tried, taking a few more steady steps before sagging against me again. It's out there, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's still following us. Charlie's flashlight beam swung toward us, then back to scanning the forest. I don't see anything, just trees. It's there, Danny insisted, his grip tightening on my jacket. I can feel it watching us. We'd covered maybe half the distance back to camp when I heard it. A heavy footstep on dead leaves, somewhere behind us in the darkness. The sound was too deliberate to be a small animal, too loud to be wind moving through branches. I stopped walking and held up my hand for silence. Charlie immediately killed his flashlight, plunging us into complete darkness except for the faint glow from Jake's phone screen. Another footstep. Closer this time, accompanied by a sound that made my skin crawl, labored breathing, like something large was moving through the woods with considerable effort. We need to go, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Right now. Jake's phone light flickered as he checked our position one more time. 400 yards northwest. Straight through that gap between the big pines. I practically lifted Danny off his feet, half carrying him as we moved as quickly as possible through the forest. Charlie stayed close behind us, turning every few steps to listen for sounds of pursuit. Jake pushed ahead, using his dying phone to navigate around fallen logs and thick patches of undergrowth. The breathing sounds grew closer. Heavy, rhythmic exhalations that seemed to come from something much larger than a person. Branches snapped under weight somewhere behind us, and I could hear whatever it was crashing through vegetation without any attempt at stealth. "Move faster," I hissed, dragging Danny forward even as his legs struggled to keep up. Charlie suddenly spun around, clicking on his flashlight and sweeping the beam back toward our trail. The light cut through the darkness between trees, illuminating patches of forest floor and hanging branches. Then it caught something. A figure moving between the pine trunks about 30 yards behind us. In the brief flash of light, I saw what looked like a man, but everything about his posture and movement was wrong. He was bent forward at an unnatural angle, arms hanging loose at his sides, head tilted too far to one side. The way he moved through the trees was jerky and unsteady, like he was fighting against his own body with every step. Charlie held the light on the figure for maybe 2 seconds before it stepped sideways behind a thick trunk and disappeared from view. But those 2 seconds were enough to burn the image into my memory, something that had once been human, but wasn't anymore. Danny started hyperventilating, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what killed Ben. That's what grabbed me." Jake had found a thick branch and picked it up, holding it like a club while positioning himself between us and the direction where the figure had vanished. "What the hell was that thing?" The breathing sounds continued, circling around us now instead of following directly behind. Whatever it was had intelligence enough to flank us, to cut off our route back to camp. I could hear it moving through the undergrowth on our left side, keeping pace with us as we stumbled forward. Charlie kept his flashlight trained on the woods, but the beam seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness surrounding us. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something. Every tree trunk could be concealing the figure we'd glimpsed. "We run," I said, making the decision with cold certainty. "Right now. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Just get to camp." I lifted Danny bodily and started crashing through the forest as fast as I could manage. Jake dropped the branch and ran ahead of us, his phone light bouncing wildly as he checked our course. Charlie followed close behind, sweeping his flashlight beam back and forth, but no longer stopping to search the shadows. Behind us, the breathing sounds turned into something else, a low, guttural noise that might have been an attempt at speech or might have been something far worse. Branches snapped as whatever was hunting us gave up stealth and began moving directly toward our position. Danny's weight across my shoulders made every step a struggle, but adrenaline kept me moving. Roots caught at my feet, low branches whipped across my face, and fallen logs appeared in our path without warning. I stumbled repeatedly but managed to stay upright, focused only on the growing glow ahead that meant our campfire was still burning. Jake's phone finally died completely, the screen going black and leaving us with only Charlie's flashlight to guide us through the last 100 yards of forest. The sounds behind us grew louder. Heavy footsteps and labored breathing and that horrible noise that might have been trying to form words. Then I saw orange light flickering between the trees ahead. Our campsite, the fire still burning, the Honda parked where I'd left it. Safety, or at least the illusion of safety after what we'd just experienced in those woods. Charlie reached the clearing first, spinning around to shine his light back toward the tree line while Jake and I emerged carrying Danny between us. The forest behind us had gone quiet again, but that silence felt more threatening than the pursuit sounds had been. I helped Danny to one of the camp chairs near the fire, where he collapsed and buried his face in his hands. Charlie maintained his position at the edge of our campsite, flashlight beams sweeping the darkness for any sign of movement. Jake grabbed our remaining gear and started throwing it toward the car. "We're leaving," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Right now. We're packing up and getting out of here." I looked back at the black wall of forest surrounding our small circle of firelight, knowing that whatever had been hunting us was still out there, watching and waiting for another opportunity. Danny was right. Something was loose in these woods, something that had killed Ben and attacked him and would have done worse to all of us if we hadn't reached camp when we did. Jake's phone screen flickered once more, then went completely black. The last source of navigation we'd had in these woods was now useless, leaving us with only Charlie's flashlight and the dying glow from our campfire. "Get everything in the car," I said, already grabbing sleeping bags and shoving them toward the Honda. "We're not spending another minute here." Jake moved to Danny's side, helping him stand from the camp chair where he'd been sitting with his head in his hands. Danny's legs were steadier now, though he still needed support as Jake guided him toward the passenger door. "We have to call the police," Danny said, his voice clearer than it had been since we'd found him. "They need to know about Ben. They need to get his body out of there." I stuffed the camp stove and cooking gear into a duffel bag, not bothering to organize anything properly. Speed mattered more than careful packing. "There's no cell service up here. We have to get to town first." Charlie remained at the edge of our campsite, sweeping his flashlight beam back and forth across the tree line. The beam caught nothing but pine trunks and hanging branches, but his tense posture suggested he expected that to change at any moment. The tent fabric tore as I yanked it down without taking time to collapse the poles properly. Everything went into the car. Sleeping bags, food containers, Danny's cigarettes, the first aid kit I'd never gotten to use on Ben. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory from years of breaking camp. But my eyes kept darting toward the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. Jake had gotten Danny settled in the passenger seat and was throwing gear into the trunk with the same desperate efficiency I felt. Water bottles, extra clothes, the GPS unit that had led us to this nightmare. Everything disappeared into the car as fast as we could move it. A branch snapped somewhere in the woods behind Charlie's position. The sound was sharp and deliberate, like something heavy had stepped on dry wood without caring about the noise. Charlie spun toward the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness between trees, but the light revealed only empty forest. "Time to go," Charlie said, backing toward the car while keeping his light trained on the woods. I grabbed the last duffel bag and threw it into the back seat as Charlie climbed in beside it. My hands were shaking as I slammed the trunk closed and moved around to the driver's side. The keys felt slippery in my palm as I fumbled them into the ignition. The engine turned over on the second try, and I immediately threw the car into reverse. Our headlights swept across the campsite as I backed away from the fire pit, illuminating the scattered remains of our weekend that we were abandoning. Beer cans, food wrappers, the folding table we'd never gotten to use. All of it left behind in our rush to escape whatever was hunting us in those woods. As we reversed toward the dirt road, the headlight beam swept across the edge of the forest where we'd heard the branch snap. Nothing moved between the trees. No figure bent at impossible angles, no glowing eyes reflecting our lights back at us. Just empty darkness that somehow felt more threatening than if we'd seen something concrete to fear. I shifted into drive and pressed the accelerator, sending gravel flying as we headed down the narrow dirt road that would take us away from Cascade Ridge. The campfire grew smaller in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely, leaving only black forest behind us. "What happened to you out there?" Jake asked quietly as we navigated the first steep curve. "After we split up looking for Ben?" Danny was staring straight ahead through the windshield, but his voice was steady when he answered. "I heard Ben calling for help, his voice coming from deeper in the woods, like he was hurt or lost, so I followed it." The dirt road was barely wide enough for one car, with pine trees pressing close on both sides. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead, but beyond that tunnel, everything was invisible. I kept the speed as high as I dared, taking curves that would have seemed reckless under normal circumstances. "But it wasn't Ben," Danny continued. "I mean, it sounded exactly like him, but when I got close enough to where the voice was coming from, there was nobody there. Just empty woods. That's when I realized something was wrong." Charlie leaned forward from the back seat. "What do you mean it sounded like him?" "Perfect imitation. Same tone, same way he pronounced words, even using phrases I'd heard him say earlier. But Ben was already dead by then, wasn't he? Already lying at the bottom of those rocks with his neck broken. The road started its steep descent toward the main highway, and I had to ride the brakes to keep us from picking up too much speed. The Honda's engine whined as we took hairpin turns that dropped us hundreds of feet with each switchback. Danny rubbed at the scratches on his face, 3 parallel lines that looked even worse in the dashboard light. Something grabbed me from behind while I was standing there trying to figure out where the voice had gone. Hands bigger than any person should have, strong enough to lift me off the ground without effort. It dragged me to that tree and just left me there. Left you? I asked. Why would it do that? I think it was going after you guys. Using me as bait, maybe, or just getting me out of the way while it hunted the rest of us. The thought made my stomach turn. Whatever had killed Ben and attacked Danny had been intelligent enough to plan, to separate us and pick us off one by one. If we hadn't found Danny when we did, if we'd spent more time searching the woods alone. We drove in silence for the next hour, the mountain road gradually leveling out as we descended toward the valley floor. My hands had stopped shaking, but I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us down the mountain. The forest on both sides of the road looked identical to what we'd just escaped. Endless black trees that could hide anything. Jake dozed fitfully in the back seat, exhausted from the adrenaline crash that had hit all of us once we'd gotten moving. Danny stayed awake, staring out at the dark landscape rolling past his window. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen out there, but I could tell he was replaying the same images I was. Ben's body twisted at the base of those rocks, the figure moving between trees with that horrible, jerky gait. The first cell tower appeared on a ridge ahead of us, just as the sky began to lighten behind the mountains. Dawn was still an hour away, but the absolute darkness was starting to fade to deep blue. I checked my phone and saw 2 bars of signal appear, the first connection to the outside world we'd had since Friday afternoon. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station at the junction where the mountain road met the main highway. The fluorescent lights over the pumps felt harsh after 2 days of firelight and flashlight beams, but they also felt safe in a way I hadn't appreciated before this weekend. My call to 911 connected on the first ring. I gave the dispatcher our location, Ben's name, and approximate coordinates for where we'd found his body. The conversation was brief and professional. The local sheriff's department would meet us here within the hour to take our statements and organize a recovery team. While we waited, I bought coffee and gas station sandwiches that none of us had the appetite to eat. Charlie sat on the hood of my car, watching the road that led back up into the mountains. Jake paced around the parking lot, checking his phone repeatedly now that he had signal again. Danny called his girlfriend Sarah, though I couldn't hear what he said to her. The sun was fully up by the time the first sheriff's deputy arrived, followed 20 minutes later by a second patrol car and an SUV marked Search and Rescue. We told our story 3 separate times to 3 different people, each account feeling less real as we repeated it. Ben Harrison, camping alone for 3 weeks. The mysterious lights he claimed to see, his obsession with following them into the woods, the accident that had killed him, and the thing that had attacked Danny afterward. I left out the part about the figure we'd seen pursuing us through the forest. Looking at the deputies in their clean uniforms, standing in the bright morning sunlight next to their official vehicles, that detail seemed too impossible to include. Let them think Ben had fallen down the rocks, and Danny had gotten disoriented in the dark. Let them find their own explanations for the scratches on his face, and the way his voice still shook when he talked about what had grabbed him. As the search and rescue team headed up the mountain road with GPS coordinates and body bags, I realized that everything between the 4 of us had changed permanently. We'd shared something in those woods that we'd never be able to explain to anyone else, something that had shown us how thin the boundary was between the normal world and whatever existed in the darkness beyond it. Danny climbed back into the passenger seat and lit a cigarette with hands that were finally steady. Charlie got in behind him, no longer watching the tree line for movement. Jake took the back seat and closed his eyes, ready to sleep for the first time in 24 hours. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, heading home. In my rearview mirror, the mountains looked peaceful and beautiful in the morning light, giving no sign of what they'd hidden in the darkness just a few hours before.